In a 2016 historiography, Raphael Medoff, the director of the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Education, wrote that there is a gap in research regarding the Protestant press and the Holocaust. There's only been one book published, and that was published in 1980. So I needed to write a paper. I chose to write my paper on that, and I settled on the very influential liberal Protestant periodical called The Christian Century and its editor, Charles Clayton Morrison. The circulation of this magazine was not very big, but it was only about 35 to 40,000, but it was people of influence, including Henry Luce, who was the founder of Times Inc., William Sweet, who was FDR's director of public relations, and Rabbi Stephen Weiss, just to name a few. He also had very well-known pastors who wrote articles for the magazine and editorials, including Reinhold Niebuhr and Harry Emerson Fosdick. So very influential magazine. And so I wanted to know how and why they made the editorial decisions that they did regarding the Holocaust, because in other books that I had read, it was very highly critical. And I was only looking at the years 1942 to 43. And in that examination, I arrived at different conclusions than some of the established scholarship. And that may be because I was only focusing on one periodical instead of multiple. And because I have access to more scholarship, there has been some new stuff written about the Christian Century and Charles Clayton Morrison. So I arrived at some different conclusions, maybe less critical than some and more critical than others, that will add to our cultural and religious understanding of the American response to the Holocaust. Now, the individual who really laid the foundation for research in the American response to the Holocaust is David Wyman. He wrote two very well-known books. They are assigned in university courses today. I would assign them if I was teaching it. Paper Walls, America and the Refugee Crisis, 1938 to 1942, and Abandonment of the Jews, America and the Holocaust, 1941 to 45. He is highly critical of all aspects of American society, including the politics, the bureaucracies, the Protestants, and the Catholics. The only one he is not nearly as critical of are the Jewish Americans. And so very critical look at the American response to the Holocaust, really discussing that it was kind of based in anti-Semitism. Now, the gold standard for research about the American press and the Holocaust is Deborah Lipstat's Beyond Belief, the American Press and the Coming of the Holocaust, 1933 to 1945. She read thousands of magazines and periodicals, religious press, secular press, like the Washington Post, the New York Times, including the Christian Century, to try to figure out what Americans would have known by reading their papers, because there was this collective amnesia after the war that they did not know. And she found that that couldn't possibly be true, that American publications published a lot extensively and in great detail about the Holocaust, but they did so skeptically. They buried the stories in the backs of their publications. And then she sought to determine why. And anti-Semitism was kind of her conclusion overall. Laurel Leff then followed up in 2005 with her book, Buried by the Times, The Holocaust in America's Most Important Newspaper, where she only investigates the New York Times as America's basically national newspaper at the time. And she found that they also buried the stories, but arrived at different conclusions as to why, because the owner of that publication was a Reformed Jew himself. The methodology in these books is very helpful for me. The only university published book about the Protestant press and the Holocaust was published in 1980 by Robert Ross. So It Was True, the American Protestant Press and the Nazi Persecution of the Jews. He examined 52 religious Protestant publications, both liberal and conservative, denominational, non-denominational, and to determine what American Protestants should have known. And he concluded that they should have known. And then what were their, publications saying that they should have done? And that was really highly dependent on what their denominational affiliation was, whether it was liberal, fundamentalist, conservative, as to what they felt should have happened with that. But they should have known. But oftentimes what happened is the publications conflated the persecution of German Christians with the persecution of the Jews. And so that was kind of interesting. Again, it's the only book on the subject. The Protestant press was not examined again until 2021, like specifically the Protestant press, when Kyle Jansen wrote a chapter for a book called The Nazi Racism, American Anti-Semitism, and Christian Duty, U.S. Mainline Protestant Responses to the Jewish refugee crisis of 1938. He examined 5 prominent liberal and conservative periodicals to gauge American attitudes toward the refugee crisis of 1938, to gauge their attitudes about Hitler, the Nazis, and Jewish persecution. And he found that Protestants were really wary of the unfolding events in Europe, not just specifically about the Jews, but everything. But as with earlier scholars, he noted that they often conflated the persecution of German Christians with the Jews. And he also points to anti-Semitism within the churches as to why they were not more receptive about accepting Jewish refugees into the United States. Then there are a couple of dissertations that are not very well known. The least known is, and I've only seen cited once in Kyle Jansen's book, was Frederick Ira Murphy's 1970 dissertation, The American Christian Press in Pre-War Hitler's Germany, 1933 to 1939, where he argues that not only did the Christian press publish about the persecution of the Jews in the 30s, but they published about it critically, even when their readers were not so critical. He also looks at American attitudes within the church, many churches struggling with anti-Semitism within their ranks, but finding that after Kristallnacht that Christians became more sympathetic, but not enough to really want any action. And then the final scholarship was published in 1981, and then he turned it into a self-published book in 2019, but it's William Camp's Religion and Horror, How the American Religious Press Viewed the Death Camps and Holocaust Survivors. He examines 15 magazines from various denominations, liberal, conservative, but also Roman Catholic magazines. And unlike Robert Ross's study, which covers the whole Nazi period, he is limited to 42 to 45, but arrives at similar conclusions. One interesting addition in his evaluation is he talks about the American Christian influence over politics. And he also noticed a trend amongst liberal Christians to abandon aspects of the social gospel, that just because they were theologically liberal did not mean that they were conservative, politically liberal. So, and he also was helpful for me as examined the variety of responses to the creation of the state of Israel. So I feel like I can add to this field with my dissertation.